Before we begin, I have channel memberships and Patreon up for those who want to support my content. It is voluntary. I will never demand people to donate to me, but it will go a long way in helping me create content. If you wish to, either click join at the bottom of this video and pick a tier that is right for you, or go to the link in the description and pick a tier that is right for you. Now onto the video. Greenwich, Connecticut is one of the richest cities in America, home to many affluent neighborhoods. On October 30th, 1974, a night known as Mischief Night, the public eye would gaze upon one of its wealthiest communities. It was here that a young woman violently lost her life. A teenage girl found in her own backyard. The last one to see her alive were members of the Kennedy family. In order to get a full picture of this crime, it is best to set the scene. Greenwich is one of the wealthiest cities in Connecticut. The most affluent and wealthy people have homes within this zip code. In fact, the average income for families living in this area is between $638,560 and $721,550, while the median annual income is between $109,250 and $155,417. Which is more than what most of us will ever make. Alice Cooper lives in Greenwich. Others who live or have lived there include the McMahon family, Ron Howard, Mel Gibson, Jim Henson, Truman Capote, and Wanda Sykes. Bellhaven is a gated community within Greenwich. It is a coastal enclave. Homes in this area today can be worth $21 million. It is clear that this area of Greenwich is upper class. No middle class families would be living in opulent living conditions like these. This is where two families lived, the Moxley family and the Skakel family. The neighborhood is protected by a gate, with security roaming around to keep an eye out for trouble, as well as the Greenwich police being a constant presence. Rushton Skakel was the brother of Ethel Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy's wife. His wife Ann died in 1973 of brain cancer, leaving him a widower of 7 children. He was a strict man, one who inherited his wealth from his father, a man named George, who founded a company called the Great Lakes Carbon Corporation, a privately owned coal company. The Moxley family lived next door. John Moxley, not that one, was the patriarch, though he went by his middle name David. He worked for an accounting firm, which led to him earning his wealth, making enough money for him to be able to afford a house in Bellhaven, which they only had been living there for a year. Along with his wife Dorothy, they had 2 children, Martha and John Jr. Again, not that John. One of Rushton's sons, Thomas Skakel, had an interest in Martha, having a crush on her, while his little brother Michael and him seemed to have a sibling rivalry over her. October 30th has gone by many names over the years, Devil's Night being the most popular, Mischief Night being another. It is a tradition for some teens to go out at night, egg homes, and throw toilet paper over homes. Which I'm pretty sure that in a neighborhood like Bellhaven, the eggs are probably diamond encrusted, and the toilet paper is gold. Also, I think that most families in the area probably don't care because they have people to clean up the mess. God, I hate the rich. Martha at the time was grounded. She had gotten in trouble with her parents because she had come home late a week before, but she was able to get them to agree to allow her to go out for Mischief Night. Her mother recalled it was because of her good behavior and her friends begging Martha to be allowed out, with the caveat that Martha would be home by 9:30. She was in trouble after all. She left the home, going out, toilet papering houses, ringing doorbells and running, typical teenage pranks. They ended up going over to the Skakel home. According to witnesses, she was flirty with Thomas Skakel, even kissing at one point. He rubbed her leg apparently, but this was weird because she had made it clear before that she was not interested in Thomas in that way. The last time that she was seen, she was following with Thomas behind a fence, which was near the pool in the Skakel family residence. Dorothy waited up for her daughter to come home. She stated in an interview that she had noticed that it was 11 p.m. and Martha hadn't come home yet. She has stated that she expected it would happen like that her daughter would be out late. Watching television, Dorothy drifted off to sleep. At 1:30 a.m., Dorothy awoke and went to Martha's room to discover that Martha still wasn't home. So she She began calling around, looking for her daughter, which included the Skakel home. Thomas answered the phone, telling Dorothy he had no idea where Martha was, that she had left at 9:30 p.m. He had gone inside after Martha headed home. For all he knew, that's where she was headed. Dorothy Moxley called the police. The police immediately showed up and looked around the neighborhood, but found nothing. Still, the response time is surprising. Normally when going over cases, the norm is that the person has to wait a while before the police will do anything. This must be a perk of being rich. I hate the rich. By sunrise, there was still no sign of Martha Moxley. The Moxleys and their neighbors began to search for Martha, only to make a tragic discovery. With the teenager missing, the Moxley family and their neighbors looked for her. All morning they searched the community. They knocked on doors, called people, looking in backyards, front yards, anywhere that the teenager could be. Then they doubled back to the Moxley home. And at 12:45 p.m. on October 31st, 1975, Martha Moxley was found, laying under a pine tree in the backyard, 200 yards away from her own home. There was a trail of blood that led from a pool of blood under a maple tree. It went across the driveway and down into a part of the yard that was easy to miss. Under that pine tree lay the battered body of Martha Moxley. She had been beaten by a golf club multiple times. Martha was a blonde-haired girl. A detective talking about the scene stated that her head was so badly bludgeoned, her hair had been dyed red, matted down with her own blood, and stabbed with a golf club after it was broken. Her pants and her underwear were down. She had been SA'd. The broken golf club was found at the scene of the attack, laying in a pool of blood under the maple tree. But missing from the golf club was the handle of the golf club. Whomever killed her, or an accomplice, had taken the part of the club where the fingerprints would be. The club was a 6-iron Tony Penna club. As the police began to go house to house to find any leads they could, they came to the Skakel home. Inside, they found a set of Tony Penna golf clubs, missing a 6-iron. Thomas Skakel had been the last person to see Martha Moxley alive. Her time of death was listed as 10 p.m., but this time was just a guess by the medical examiner at the time. Later, it was ruled that her time of death could have been anywhere between 9:30 p.m. and 5 a.m., which made Thomas a prime suspect in her murder. Rustin Skakel had been away that week, leaving his children in the care of a man who had just moved into the house the same day that Martha was killed. Kenneth Littleton was hired to tutor the Skakel kids. According to Thomas, at 9:30, Martha went home. He went to his room and began doing a research project for school on Abraham Lincoln. But when the police talked to the school, no such project was due. Michael Skakel also had an alibi. According to Michael, he had gone to his cousin's home to watch Monty Python. Kenneth Littleton's alibi was that he was in his room watching The French Connection, that Thomas had joined him at one point in the evening. While Thomas's alibi of doing a school project was shaky, Kenneth stating that Thomas showed up in his room and watched part of a movie gave him somewhat of an alibi. Police were able to get a hold of Rushton and asked permission to search his home. Rushton allowed a search of his home. When they looked for the golf clubs mentioned before, they noticed there were other clubs that were missing. They were found in the backyard, all except the 6-iron. The police were in over their heads. This was the first time most of them worked a murder case, leaving them to make mistakes, like not taking the set of clubs from the house. They did not find anything else but the clubs. No bloody clothes, no blood-covered footwear. Then the Skakel family stopped cooperating with the police and barred the police from looking up school records on the Skakel children, as well as their mental health records. The investigation came to a standstill, but the focus was still on Thomas, but they could not prove it. The Skakel family were related to the Kennedys by the marriage of Ethel Skakel to Robert F. Kennedy. Michael and Thomas were Robert Kennedy's nephews, but their home was full of dysfunction. Thomas was the older of the two and had developed some habits his father had. Rushton was a raging alcoholic, and Thomas was slowly following in his footsteps. Michael, the younger of the two eldest boys, was no better. He had been kicked out of many schools for behavioral problems, to the point that he was sent to a school for troubled teens called Elan School in Poland Springs, Maine, which was a private institution, and it didn't have the best track record when it came to punishments for rowdy students. 11 children from the school accused the school of mistreatment. Michael himself claimed to have witnessed beatings and public humiliation of students by the hands of staff. Even he himself was subject to some of these. One of these punishments was called the boxing ring, where students would surround one student and gang beat the student. This happened to Michael himself. The Skakel family held on to their secrets tightly. They stopped working with police, and that raised suspicion that there was something to hide. Well, it could just be the trouble that Thomas and Michael constantly found themselves in, and how that was a source of shame for a wealthy family. But it could also be that they were hiding something more sinister. The handle of the golf club had been missing. Could the Skakels be hiding that? Or was there something more? The 70s came and went without the police able to find new leads. They felt they had a suspect, someone in the Skakel house. Kenneth Littleton or Thomas Skakel was high on their lists. After all, Kenneth didn't have the best reputation as well. He had, in a drunken stupor, stolen $4,000 worth of goods while in Nantucket. This was after he had been fired by Rushton because Littleton had failed as a tutor. Kenneth Littleton also threw a cinder block through a shop window. It was his violent actions and seemingly criminal behavior that landed him on the radar as a possible suspect. Thomas, being the last one to see Martha Moxley, was the main suspect. His alibi made little sense. Why would somebody be working on a school project that didn't exist? The only thing was, there was no evidence to link him to the murder. No blood-stained clothing, no fingerprints. The only clue came from the Skakel home, and that was the missing golf club. And where that Six Irons location was before being used to murder Martha wasn't known. If it had been in the home, it could point directly to the Skakel family. If it was outside with the other missing clubs found there, then anyone could have done it. In the 80s, the police didn't get any leads. It wasn't until 1991 that this cold case would heat up and point the finger at a suspect that the police hadn't bothered to look at. That suspect was Michael Skakel. In the 1990s, a couple of things happened that led to the case being looked at for the first time in years. The first happened in 1991, with the trial of William Kennedy Smith. Smith was a cousin of the Skakel brothers. He was accused of R-wording a woman, and he went to trial for it. During the trial, a rumor surfaced that he had been in the Skakel home the night that Martha Moxley died. Because Martha had been SA'd, it looked like there was more to this than what met the eye, but it was just a rumor. There was no way to prove that he was there the night Martha Moxley died. Rushton Skakel also hired a private investigator at the time. The private investigator leaked that Michael and Thomas's alibis had changed since that night. But I am getting ahead of myself, so sit tight because I'm going to go through this more. First, I need to talk about the books that came out in the 90s that helped in relaunching the case. 2 books, written by vastly different people. First, Dominic Dunn. I have gone over the death of his daughter Dominique in a video last year. Since Dominique's death, Dominic became more involved in true crime and reporting on crimes. He wrote a book, a fiction book based on the murder of Martha Moxley, changing the names, but keeping the way she was murdered intact, with the only difference being the murderer used a baseball bat instead of a golf club. The book was titled A Season in Purgatory. He had met with Dorothy and championed her cause. As a father whose daughter was brutally murdered, he sympathized with Dorothy. Dorothy Moxley, who is still alive today, considers Dominic Dunn her guardian angel. The second book was A Murder in Greenwich, written by Mark Fuhrman. Mark Fuhrman is better known as the racist cop in the O.J. Simpson trial. Fuhrman found a glove with blood on it on Simpson's property, so he was called to testify. Simpson's lawyer, F. Lee Bailey, asked Fuhrman if he had ever used the N-word. Fuhrman, on the stand, claimed that he didn't, but an audio tape disproved that claim, causing Fuhrman to be tried for perjury and lose his job, as well as putting some level of doubt on the evidence against O.J. Simpson. Now, Fuhrman is a piece of crap for using those words in any case, and he made the LAPD look bad when he did it. But it's worth saying that in 1981, while as a regular police officer, Fuhrman had requested time away, and he did so because he felt afraid that he would harm or kill someone of a different race. He went to therapy, and in 1985 he returned to active duty. What was said on those tapes was wrong, and even he said so in the book A Murder in Brentwood, which went over the O.J. Simpson case. He also stated that the tape allegedly came from interviews he had with screenwriters. According to Fuhrman, they asked him how racist cops would talk, and he answered. Again, this is alleged, and his use of racial words cannot be forgiven, but I need to stress that he took responsibility for his words, and he deemed them immature and irresponsible. Soon after the publication of A Murder in Brentwood, he began to investigate the Martha Moxley murder, and he came up with his own theory on who killed her. The man he suspected was Michael Skakel. Michael Skakel's alibi changed. While I cannot find what Thomas's alibi turned to because podcasts differ on it, Michael's, they all say the same thing. While he first claimed that he had gone to his cousin's house to watch Monty Python, it changed to that he had left the house of his cousin in a drunken stupor and went home. But he didn't go home. Instead, he went to the Moxley property, climbed a tree overlooking what he thought was Martha's window, and tried to get her attention. Issue was, it was John Jr.'s window, and he wasn't there. So instead, well, I have no idea how to say this. He tickled his pickle in the tree. That was his alibi. He couldn't have killed her because he was too busy in the tree massaging his sausage. I can't make this up. Also, while he was at Elan, one of his fellow students stated that Michael Skakel had confessed to killing Martha Moxley, though other accounts from people who knew him claimed that he stated he was too drunk and didn't remember if he did it or not. Michael Skakel did have a motive. Jealousy of his brother's crush on Martha. Martha seemingly flirting with Thomas. Thomas and Martha kissing. Thomas able to rub her leg without her getting overly pissed and punching him. Even though Martha had no interest in either boy. He had the means. A golf club that was missing from the home. And he had the opportunity. Because of his new alibi, he put himself and his DNA right near the scene of the crime. But the handle of the golf club was still missing, and the wealth of the Skakel family could keep the police at bay. But if you remember from earlier, I mentioned that private investigators were hired by Rushton. They were to try to clear his son's names. The Sutton agency was hired and ran up a large bill trying to clear Michael and Thomas Skakel of any wrongdoing. The PI firm signed a confidentiality agreement. The agency had access to the Skakel brothers like no one had before. For 3 years, the agency investigated everything, including DNA evidence, which came in the form of clothes that Martha had been wearing that night. With things seemingly turning in favor that someone in the Skakel home might have committed the murder, Rushton Skakel halted the report fully, stopping the PI's investigation in its tracks, paying off the bill, so to speak, which reeks of cover-up. There was something in that report that Rushton didn't want leaked, but something was leaked. Though Rushton thought that he covered all his tracks with the confidentiality agreements, he missed one person. The person who the Sutton agency had hired to do the DNA testing. That person stole the findings of the DNA analysis and gave it to Dominic Dunn, who in turn gave it to Mark Furman. Because Michael Skakel had stated that he was in a tree doing something unholy, it gave a reason for his DNA to be on the scene. But it seemed like the case was coming to a close, with the arrest and trial of Michael Skakel. But justice isn't perfect, and in this case, you will see why. In 1998, a one-man jury was convened in the murder of Martha Moxley. This was rare, one man to decide the fate of another, for the sole purpose of seeing if there was enough evidence to arrest Michael Skakel for the murder of Martha Moxley. On January 9, 2000, it was determined that there was enough evidence and an arrest warrant was issued. Michael turned himself in, and he was arraigned in juvenile court first, even though he was in his 40s. There was an issue the state of Connecticut faced. Because Michael was a teenager when the murders took place, the court had to decide if he was going to be tried as an adult or as a juvenile. As I said, Michael was in his 40s at the time he was arrested, but he was arrested for a murder that took place when he was 15 years old. The difference between the two is the length of the sentence. If he had been tried as a juvenile, he could face only 3 years in prison due to him being 15 at the time of the murder, but as an adult, it's a life sentence. The court ended up ruling that he would be tried as an adult, and he pled not guilty. During his trial, his first alibi was told. Then an excerpt from a book he was writing with the whole raising of the mast was read out. Yep, he was going to write a book about living next door to Martha Moxley when she was murdered. You can find excerpts of it online. This excerpt was in audio form. He had been dictating past events so that he would remember them when he was to write them in the book. So the jury got to hear all of this. He also stated in the audio that he had been afraid to tell the truth of what he was doing that night. He was afraid that he had been seen and had panicked about it, creating the alibi that he went over to his cousin's home. Now here comes the twist. The entire jury heard all of that, but not the whole self-love part. The prosecution decided to play the audio in a way that made it look like he was confessing to murder, as well as using crime scene photos of Martha's dead body flashing over a monitor at the same time the audio was playing. This is highly deceptive. They used an excerpt from a book Skakel had been planning on writing, where he was talking about being perverted, and twisted it to make it sound like a confession, and he was found guilty because of this. Jurors stated in later interviews that it was the graphic picture superimposed over the audio of what they thought was a confession that led to their decision to find him guilty. Even Dorothy Moxley thinks he's guilty, but was he? In January of 2003, Michael Skakel's cousin, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., wrote an article for the Atlantic Monthly called A Miscarriage of Justice, which claimed that Skakel was wrongfully convicted of Martha Moxley's murder. He argued that there was more evidence that Kenneth Littleton could have been the killer. He called Dominic Dunn the driving force behind Michael Skakel being thrown in prison. In July of 2016, Kennedy also released a book called Framed. By the way, I love how he downplays Mark Fuhrman's role in putting Skakel away, as it was mostly Fuhrman's theory that led to Skakel being arrested. It wasn't long after his conviction that in 2003, Michael Skakel tried to appeal his conviction, claiming that the prosecution misled the jury and that led to his conviction, but also claiming, due to statute of limitations in Connecticut, he should have been tried in juvenile court and that the court made an error with trying him as an adult, which he had a point on the first part, but not sure on the second. But it doesn't matter what I think, it was denied. Skakel ended up firing his attorneys and getting new ones, who in 2007 filed a writ of habeas corpus and demanded a new trial. This had to do with Tony Bryant, who is the cousin of the late great Kobe Bryant. Tony claimed in an interview with private investigators hired by Skakel that he was around during the time Martha was killed, and that he saw her, and he wanted to do things to her that are illegal. The filing failed. In March of 2009, a 5-judge panel was convened to hear arguments again for an appeal, and again, an appeal was denied. Michael Skakel was given a parole hearing too on October 24, 2012, where parole was denied because he refused to say he killed Martha Moxley. But finally, on October 23, 2013, he got a break. A new trial for him was ordered, and he was released on bail. This time, the judge heard arguments that the original defense didn't bother to bring up any of the other suspects in the case that would prove doubt in Skakel's guilt. The Moxley family was shocked that Michael Skakel was let out of prison. To this day, the family considers Michael the murderer. In 2016, the decision to retry him was overturned, and he was to be put back in prison. But in 2018, that was overruled, and he was allowed to be out with the same conditions he had before, which was, he cannot go near the Moxley family, who do not live in Belhaven anymore, but live in New York City. He had to wear a GPS monitor. Now we get to the more recent developments in this case. In 2020, it was declared that Michael Skakel would not be retried, and all requirements on him were lifted. Also, it came to light that allegedly the 6 Irons handle had been turned over to police in 1999, but the police apparently never filed a report. So, just my opinion, this should be taken with a grain of salt, because a report was never filed. It is hard to know if this is a fact, and this is where we are now. What was thought to have been solved now is unsolved again. I had thought about making this video for my Innocence Project series, but here's the thing. I personally do not think he is innocent, and because of that, I cannot consider him for that project. That project is for those who did not commit the crime they are accused of. But don't get me wrong, misleading a jury to ensure a conviction is not, by any means, something that should be allowed. He should have been retried on the basis of the misleading closing arguments by the prosecution. And because I believe everyone has the right to a fair trial, I cannot consider him guilty as well. I can only outline the facts of the case, which facts aren't biased and don't care about your feelings. Hell, you could make an argument for any of the 3 main suspects. Michael, as well as Kenneth Littleton and Thomas Skakel, all have means and opportunity to kill Martha Moxley. The motive differs for each. Kenneth, due to his history of violence. Michael could be for multiple reasons, like being caught up a tree doing something perverted, or jealousy of his brother Thomas. Thomas Skakel's motives could be that he was just led on by a girl he liked. But here are the facts. Kenneth Littleton's DNA was not at the scene, ruling him out. Thomas Skakel and Martha Moxley fooled around that night, which was corroborated by multiple witnesses. So his DNA being on Martha's body makes sense. Michael's DNA being at the scene scene at all is the outlier, and claiming that he was doing something up a tree is a poor excuse for why his DNA would be at the scene. Is it possible? Yes. Probable? Probably not. The stench of cover-up using wealth and privilege is all over this case. From being able to stop police from looking into the psychiatric and school records of 2 boys, to the missing evidence that could have led to the real killer. Someone killed Martha Moxley in a brutal fashion. Who I think is most likely is Michael Skakel. Martha Moxley was a beautiful young woman who met a violent end. And due to where it was, the type of people that were involved, unless someone confesses to the murder, this case has gone from being solved to unsolved.